This podcast is the design of City Sites Urban Media, and our goal is to bring into focus the difference between culture and God's ideas found in His Word. To learn more, go to citysitesurbanmedia.com.
The nation and people of Moab appear many times in the historical records of the Bible. From their origins ascribed to Lot and his daughter in Genesis chapter 19, to a frightened Moab hiring Balaam the prophet to curse Israel, all the way to the time period of the kings of Israel, this nation has an interesting place within Scripture. Related to Israel via Abraham's nephew Lot, the land of Moab was located just east of the Dead Sea. In 2 Kings chapter 3 verse 4, King Mesha of Moab is named a sheep breeder. This King Mesha is at once an enemy of the worst kind, willing to sacrifice his firstborn son and crown prince of Moab just to win a battle against Israel and Judah. While much of the history of the interchanges between Israel and Moab are as violent enemies, there are brief periods of peace between the nations. Eventually, the nation of Moab, along with many others, was conquered and absorbed by the Empire of Assyria in the late 8th century BC.
This is the City Sites Podcast with Larry Kutzler.
A good friend of mine, we'll call him Sean, had a conversation the other day about the end times and the things that will be taking place. And we just had this wonderful conversation. And he said to me that, did you know that the Bible talks about the resurgence of the nation of Moab? And I said, not really. Well, he said that in the last days, the Lord said He was going to raise up the spirit of Moab in the last days. I thought, what does that really mean? As I began to think about Moab and the spirit of Moab and what the nation of Moab meant to Israel in the early days of their history, it has some significance. Let me explain. Well, as we began to process the things that were taking place in our surrounding neighborhoods, and it all reminded us of examples that we read in Scripture. For example, the people of Moab were related to the Israelites and were considered people who were a thorn in their side. Here is some history on this people group that we call Moab. According to Genesis 19:30-38, the ancestor of Moabites was Lot, by incest with his eldest daughter. She and her sister, having lost their fiancés and their mother in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, decided to continue their father's line through intercourse with him. The elder got him drunk to facilitate the deed and conceived Moab. The younger daughter did the same and conceived a son named Ben-Ammi, who became the ancestor to the Ammonites. We can see from the historical record that the root of this people group was formed from an immoral relationship. It seems that the Moabites were people that were spared from being eliminated by Israel several times in Scripture. David spared them so that he would use them as servants. In 2 Samuel 8:2, and he smote Moab and measured them with a line, casting them down to the ground. Even with 2 lines measured, he put to death, and with 1 full line to keep them alive. And so the Moabites became David's servants and brought gifts. One commentator put it, Moab was always about bringing Israel to ruin. According to Revelation 2:14, Balaam told King Balak how to get the Israelites to commit sin by enticing them with sexual immorality and food sacrificed to idols. The Israelites fell into transgression due to those traps, and God sent a deadly plague to them as a result in Numbers 31:16. The same Moabite spirit is alive and well today. We see it in the Middle East as well as in Europe, where anti-Semitism is on the rise. In Jeremiah 48:46-47, we find these words. Woe to you, O Moab, the people of Chemosh, who have perished. For your sons have been taken into exile, and your daughters have gone into captivity. Yet in the latter days I will restore Moab from captivity, declares the Lord. Here ends the judgment of Moab. So, this spirit of Moab that started in immorality, that plagued Israel the entire time they were forming the nation in the land that God gave to them, and is still working to destroy the people of promise. When you consider the god of Moab was Chemosh, which means destroyer, subduer, or fish god. Remember, God said he was going to revive this spirit in the last days. This spirit is based upon the religious deity of destruction and submission, which is the same spirit that I think Islam projects in our world today. From 2 Kings 3:27, then he took his oldest son that should have reigned in his stead, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And there was great indignation against Israel, and they departed from him and returned to their own land. One commentator said that the human sacrifice was to Chemosh, and without doubt it was the way of appeasing the wrath of this god, which the people feared. All of this, of course, was based upon the imagination of a foolish people. That same foolish fear takes hold of people today by giving heed to the spirit of Moab. As was stated above in Jeremiah 48, God will raise up the spirit of Moab in the last days. One of the ways I believe that spirit has been revived today is through Islam. It has the same characteristics that generate fear, intimidation, deception, and lies. It manifests most obviously in the Muslim world, but because of its evil roots, it can manifest in the West through radical views of politicians and political parties. Moab was used to infiltrate Israel through the immoral ways of their culture. Their influence was to create a diversion away from God and away from the direction God was taking them. This spirit of Moab may not be a relevant theme in our churches today, but its effects are. Moab was related to Israel through Lot, and that was due to an immoral act by Lot's daughters. Remember, Moab's great attribute was their influence, and that influence was to divert Israel away from God. In many of our families today, the influence capturing the hearts and minds of extended family members isn't the influence of God, but it is of this world. At many family gatherings today, we have a strong presence of goodwill, but little conversation about God. We have learned as Christians to be soft on God and big on goodwill. Goodwill defined is where we do not bring up any topics that would cause an argument. We all have been there, and it's very difficult. My purpose is to call your attention to the influence around us today that compromise our faith in God to the goodwill of our culture. That's influence. The spirit of Moab was a spirit of influence that created compromise, changing our direction constantly away from God. Be careful about the influences in your life. I guess the question for me on this Moab spirit is, why would God raise up a spirit like Moab in the last days? What purpose does it serve to have another evil influencing spirit in the world? That is a good question, but if my theory is right, Islam has the same kind of spirit that resembles that of Moab. Both Moab and Islam use deception to further their cause. Both come from an immoral beginning with leaders who were far from any kind of righteous behavior, and the ultimate goal of both was to gain control over others. I am convinced that what drove Moab to deceive and lie to destroy Israel is the same spirit that drives Islam to do the same. Islam is a hate-filled system, and its intent is to gain control by demanding Sharia law to be the influence in the land. So why would God allow a spirit like Moab to be raised up in these last days? I believe God allows this resistance to him to draw people to him. James tells us to resist the devil and draw near to God, and that is our mandate for the last days. We have entered into a time in world history where the enemy is more difficult to identify. In the past, we knew who the good guys were from the bad guys, but today good is called evil and evil is called good, so it is much more difficult to know what is truth. This is why our churches must start teaching from a basis of discernment. Truth has been tainted by falsehood, and most of us are not aware of how it is affecting our faith and practice of Christianity. Discernment is a gift that distinguishes what is from God and what is not. Remember, the spirit of Moab is one of influence, And if that influence is not discernible from the perspective of good and evil, it will go undetected and be absorbed into the fabric of the faithful. That is how this works. That is why we need to draw near to God by being absorbed by His Word and resist that which is in the world that is trying to get a hold in our lives. Today's big need in the church is for discernment, knowing what is from God and what is not.
The Greek word for the accuser is the word kategoros, which is where we get the word categories. The fingerprints of the accuser is all over the orchestration of information all over our world. And we have to begin to realize, wait a second, I'm being invited into division to stand as a representative of one of the categories. I have to understand that is not my place on this earth in this generation. I am not a flute in the orchestra of the enemy. And I won't be taking my instructions from that maestro. I have a completely different conductor. But discernment is what allows me to see each maestro. It allows me to see the invitation into where I'm going to put my energy, into where I'm going to participate. Paul writes to the Corinthians, talking about how, hey, just because we're different doesn't mean we're not of the same Spirit. We are. The gifts are of the same Spirit, the same Lord. Over and over and over, Jesus is talking about we are one.
Well, thanks for joining us for the Friday edition of the City Sites blog. That's our audio portion of the week. Remember, on Monday and Wednesday, we do the blog writings, and on Friday, we do an interview or commentary by myself. We hope you'll pass this along. I hope you'll allow others the opportunity to hear something that they probably don't hear in their local church. We want to bring the other side of the gospel into focus, where God is not only the love and the mercy and the grace that He has presented in the gospel, but He is also expecting things from His body that we often overlook. That's what we're trying to do with a prophetic, discerning kind of spirit as we look in the Scripture, as we look at the world and compare the world with the Scriptures to find out the differences between good and evil and how we live out our lives as a result of it.
Thank you for joining us today. Every Friday we bring you this podcast with interviews with people who are challenging the status quo of Christianity and challenging the cultural norms of our day. Please help us get the word out by sharing the link to this podcast with your online friends and family. Our website also contains other podcasters who are a part of the City Sites network of communicators, all sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Our website is citysitesurbanmedia.com.
This is the City Sites Podcast Network.